Hi, everyone. In this video, we're going to look at what effects does a monopolist have on the economy, on the consumer producer, who benefits and who's harmed by a monopolist. So before we get into this, I kind of have three definitions that we need to look into. These aren't necessarily on your notes, but we want to know what they are and be familiar with them. So we have these things called consumer and producer surplus. And with these, what we're going to look at is so for the consumer surplus, what is the consumer willing to pay for a good, and what do they actually get to spend on it? Um, so in this case, and we want to find the difference between them. So if we think about water bottles being sold, if push came to shove, you'd be willing to spend $5 on a water bottle, but you only have to spend $1.50. We would say that you have some consumer surplus from that because you're not spending as much as you'd absolutely be willing to spend. So with this, mathematically, what we're going to look at is our price that we'd be willing to pay minus the market price. And then on producer surplus, it's just going to be the opposite of that. So we're going to look at the price of what the producer received for a good minus what they'd be willing to sell it for. So for this one, this would be our market price for any individual consumer minus the price that they'd be willing to sell it for. And if we add these two together, we get what's called total surplus, which basically, as you can imagine, it combines the two. But what it tells us is it tells us the overall well-being of the society. Right? So as we're going through and we're figuring out how do we want to produce our goods, in general, we want to maximize this total surplus. And if anything's left out, right, we want as much total surplus as we can get. So graphically, what this is going to look like, right, we have our price and our quantity. So going down, like always, we have a demand curve. Going up, we have a supply curve. If we find our equilibrium, right, it'd be right here where they meet. Then from here, we get an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. So when we're talking about consumer surplus, right, we have, say this equilibrium price is $5. Right, we have this consumer up here who's willing to pay maybe $10 for the good, but they only have to pay $5. Right, then we have this person here, right, they're maybe willing to pay $7, but again, they only have to pay $5. And if we add up every single one of these potential consumers to the left of our equilibrium quantity, what we'll be able to do is we can kind of highlight this triangle a little bit. So we highlight this triangle, and the area of that triangle is going to be our consumer surplus. Right. It's just adding everything up together and figuring out what the consumers will be willing to spend. Then on the other side, for our producers, right, we have our last producer, right, they'd be willing to sell their product for $5 and they get to sell it for $5. But we have our low-cost producers up here. Say this first one maybe would be willing to sell their good for $1. This second one for maybe $2.50, and so on. But if we add all these together, we could find the area of this triangle, and then we get our producer surplus. Right? And graphically, it's going to look something like this. Then if we add the two together, as we can kind of imagine, we have our total surplus here in orange. Right? And overall, our goal is going to maximize the total surplus. So this is going to help us figure out how does the monopoly affect different people. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the competitive market to the monopolist, And the competitive market's going to look pretty much exactly like we just drew. So we have our demand, supply, we find our equilibrium price. That's P star. And we can highlight this triangle between the demand curve and the price. That's our consumer surplus. And this triangle between the price and the supply curve will be our producer surplus. Right, so we have our surpluses, and we see the total surplus. Again, it's just the whole, basically that whole triangle to the left. However, when we have a monopolist, things look a little different. So we have our P, and we'll also want to note our equilibrium quantity. It's going to help us see the changes in goods. So when we look at our monopolist, if we do our best to draw the same graph, we have our demand, but now we have a marginal cost curve. Excuse me, we have a marginal revenue curve. And then going up, we'll have our marginal cost. So just like normal, for monopolist, remember we set our marginal revenue equal to our marginal cost. And this gives us, say, the quantity for a monopolist. And then we'll scroll on up. Then what we'll see in this case, we have our price up here because they're going to charge the highest price that they can. And that's going to give us, say, the price for the monopolist. Then if we graph our consumer and producer surplus, just like we did before, I will take the demand curve down to our price. And this triangle up here will be our consumer surplus. Then for our producer surplus, it's not going to make really a triangle. It's going to go out to our quantity. Then it's going to go down. Then we'll kind of ride that marginal cost curve up. And this little backwards Nevada would be our producer surplus. And if you notice one little thing that's changed, in the monopolist, we have this triangle right here that's just kind of left blank, which I'm going to highlight in blue. Right, so we have that little triangle right there that's left blank, whereas for the competitive market, that is filled in. So this is going to be called deadweight loss, and we might abbreviate that as DWL for deadweight loss. And that's going to be what we lose by, what society loses by getting into a monopolistic market. So if we look at this graph, we can kind of see some effects that we're interested in. Right, and the first thing that we'll look at is the price. We'll see the price went from this equilibrium price, right, this equilibrium price, which is also right here on this graph, up to PM. So since the price of the monopolist is greater than that equilibrium price, a monopolist will cause the price to rise. Or they cause a higher price. If we look at our quantities, we'll see that in the competitive market, I'll kind of draw on this graph just so that we're on the same page. We see that our equilibrium quantity is going to be greater than our monopolist quantity. So the quantity for the monopolist is less than that of the competitive market. So again, our monopolist will cause the quantity to actually decrease. So from here, what we'll be interested in is what happens to our consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So if we look at our consumer surplus, originally, it would have taken basically this entire triangle, but now it kind of shrunk up and got pushed up to this little bit up here. So our consumer surplus for the monopolist would have decreased. And this tells us that our consumers are now worse off. For our producer surplus, initially our producer surplus would have been this it would have just been kind of this red triangle over here. We can kind of see it in the next graph. What we see happen is we replace this rectangle with this, excuse me, replace the triangle with a rectangle, and what we'll see happen, I can't really tell how clear it is through this graph, but we'll see happen is that our producer surplus is going to increase. So the producer will become better off. And then our total surplus, as we kind of saw, it's going to decrease. And it's going to go down basically from this dead weight loss that we showed a couple seconds ago. Right. So our total surplus decrease, which means that as a whole, society is worse off. And in theory, right, as we get in applications, things might change. But by our model alone, society becomes worse off. And that's because we have that dead weight loss. Right. So in general, what we're going to see, and in the next video, we'll kind of talk about some policy that we take towards monopolists, as well as certain types of price discrimination that monopolists can use. But we'll see how monopolists affect the market. Are they good? Are they bad? And we'll kind of look at some legislation that keeps them in check. So have a good day. As always, if there's anything about this video that's not clear, if you need anything, feel free to let me know, and I'll do whatever I can to help you out. Have a good day.